Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast, and we are coming up on Act 3 in the book of Esther. We're getting down to the home stretch. We finished chapter 6 last time around, and now we're getting into the wrap-up. The big drama is about to happen. All the payoffs happen next. The next book after Esther is Job. Not the next book that we're going to be covering. We're not going to do Job next. No, I mean literally in the Bible, when you get to the end of Esther and you turn the page, the next one up is Job. And if you go and just read straight through the Bible, it's going to feel pretty narratively cohesive all the way up to where we are to the end of the book of Esther. You can kind of track it on a timeline. There's a couple of dips backward into history in 1st and 2nd Chronicles where you're like, wait, didn't we already cover some of this? Yeah, but then it moves you back up to current, and then you move into Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, where we are now, and it all sort of flows. But then you turn the page to Job, and everything feels different. The timeline is different. We're in a totally different era, something much more ancient, much more shrouded in the mystery, the fog of history. We got a different literary style going on. We've got different turns of phrases. We've got different pressures. And only in the broadest sense is Job narrative. It's kind of a story that has a lot of action on the front end, and then it's all conversation. So it is narrative in that sense. It's like, then he said, then the other guy listened, and then he responded, and then another guy listened to that, and he was sitting there too, and he said. So it is kind of narrative-y in its structure, but really it's a classical wisdom book. And we see this genre across a lot of cultures in the ancient world and the classical world, where it's a dialogue. Some of the early apologists, I think of Justin Martyr, he would write an account of a whole dialogue, a whole back and forth. A lot of the Greek philosophers would do this as well. And in doing so, you really get a sense of how two ideas match up against each other. So instead of writing a treatise about like, okay, people who hold the philosophy of determinism would argue the following 15 bullet points, but people who are free will libertarians argue the opposing 15 bullet points. And this is how they would reply to that. And this is how the other team would reply to that. Instead, you just give it flesh and bones, and you have people represent a given idea and articulate their idea. And then someone listens well, and they respond from their different perspective. So in that sense, Job is lightly narrative, but more so its genre is this classical literature dialogue comparison of ideas and philosophies kind of style. Why am I talking about Job so much? Well, I think one of the reasons that Esther and Job bump up against each other and are positioned next to each other in the Bible is that there are a lot of echoes between these two books, and it seemed like the little gap here between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Esther would be a good moment to think about a few of those things. Esther, as we've discussed so many times, doesn't mention God, famously. Yet it promotes an understanding of God's constant activity and his providence and his control over history. And the lesson, or one of the big lessons of Esther, is a right posture before God and an understanding that God, even when unseen or unnamed, is always at work and always powerful and never takes days off. So in that sense, Esther has a little bit of a parable, a wisdom literature. Parable is too strong a word, but a little bit of a wisdom literature angle, and that there's something obviously that you need to take away from this beyond just the events it recounts. Job is much more overt in that it is communicating lessons about a right understanding of God and a right posture before God in his providence and in his decision-making, in when he chooses to give and in when he chooses to take away, in when it looks like he intervenes and when it looks like he chooses not to intervene. They really do deal with a lot of the same themes. And even specifically, narratively, there are a bunch of echoes between the two books. The book of Job, as a reminder to those of you who've already read it, and as an introduction to those of you who haven't yet, is a book that opens in the heavens, and God and Satan are having a conversation about this guy Job, who's a good dude. He's upright and he's faithful, and life has worked out pretty well for him. God has blessed him. He's got flocks, he's got property, he's got money, he's the head of a household. He's a patriarch in the truest sense. And Satan comes to him and is like, I don't like this Job guy, and I think the only reason he likes you is because you give him so many things. What if you were to make his life a little bit harder? Satan says, I tell you what would happen. I think that he would curse you and he would turn on you in a second. I think people only love you or worship you, God, because you give them stuff. And I'd like to test what happens if you don't. This is a massive paraphrase. And God, in a move that's pretty surprising, is like, okay, do what you will. And I mean, there's a whole discussion to be had about what you make of God's decision there. But the story holds it out as Satan gets to unleash some pain on Job. And one day, Job is just having a normal day. His kids are all having a big party, and a whole bunch of calamities befall him all at once. And his servants keep showing up and saying things like, there's lightning or some kind of fire from above and it burned all your fields and everything. It's all gone. Everybody died. I'm the only one who's left to come and tell you this. All your flocks are dead. I'm the only one who's here to tell you this. We got raided. Everybody got killed. I'm the only one who's left. There was a terrible wind at the party your kids were having. The whole thing collapsed. Everybody died. All your kids. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you what's left. And the way it's structured, it feels like this is a morality tale, maybe not a precisely literal telling of specific events. Other people look at it and they're like, no, it's describing something that literally is meant to be understood as literally occurring in this way. It could go either way. The point is the same. Job is a wreck and he's heartbroken, but Job doesn't curse God. So Satan takes one more swipe at him and gives him boils. And when it's all said and done, Job is found no longer a wealthy patriarch with a rich family life. He's sitting alone in a pile of ashes, scraping at boils on his skin with busted up pieces of pottery. And at this point, his wife and then 3 of his friends show up to offer him counsel, to help him make sense of these events and what's going on. And if you've been with me through the book of Esther, probably already, you're having some alarm bells going off. You're like, oh, wow, there are some echoes there. In no particular order, here are some of those echoes. Job goes through a time of tremendous suffering, like Mordecai goes through a time of tremendous suffering. Both end up in ashes, presumably sackcloth. Maybe the sackcloth would stick to the open sores, so maybe Job's just buck naked or just wearing a loincloth sitting in ash. But either way, it's a picture of grief. He's changed his attire to fit his emotional state. And Haman also ends up in that kind of state, covering his head and changing the way he presents himself out of grief. Haman, after the ill-fated, if you're Haman, parade of Esther chapter 6, gathers together his buddies and his wife, and they try to help him make sense of what has just happened. Neither Haman's wife nor Job's wife has a particularly positive outlook on things. Haman's wife says, nah, you're going to come to ruin and there's nothing you can do about it. Job's wife says, curse God and die. She's angry. She's furious. In both Job and Esther, the friends come along. In Esther, they come along to talk with Haman. In Job, they come along to talk with Job. And in both cases, that first round of friends, they show up and that's a win, but they don't give the best advice. They don't turn out to be the most effective friends. Job loses all of his sons. The fate of Haman's sons hasn't yet been stated in this podcast, but I'm just going to go ahead and spoil it for you. They all die too. And for Job, those sons die because of the weight of the timbers of his own home. That's a metaphor. That's intentional, I think. And really for Haman, taking some cues from what we learned back in Ezra from Darius's decree about what is supposed to happen to people the king is not very happy with, in whom the king does not delight, a beam from their house is supposed to be taken down, and they're supposed to be impaled upon that beam. That's how Darius liked to punish people, according to the book of Ezra. Well, effectively, that's what happens to Haman and his sons, is a beam of his own making is the instrument of the death of his household as well. Both Job and Haman's literal houses result in the end of their metaphorical houses. So you heard me a second ago hinting at some general parallels between the two, but I'm really seeing the parallels between Job and Haman, and it's like 3 or 4 pages worth of difference total in the Bible as the crow flies between the two characters. I mean, you can't forget Haman and his situation as you turn the page and get over to learning about Job and his situation. But there's an intentional contrast between the two that I think we might miss if Job were situated far off somewhere else in the Bible. Haman was resisting and cursing God from the beginning. Job never would do it. Haman, even according to his own wife and friends, brought this upon himself, but Job did not bring this upon himself. God didn't even really bring it upon Job. The things that happened to Job were a product of evil, not even just fluke or circumstance. So the anatomy of these two things is not the same. Haman's friends show up and give him terrible, murderous advice, and Haman goes along with it. Job's friends show up, and they also say, well, this is your fault. But Job isn't satisfied with that explanation, that how God works is just sort of like karma or fate, that if you do nice things, you get nice things. If you do bad things, you get bad things, because Job is like, but I love God. Then I didn't deviate from that. I served and worshiped God, and this isn't a punishment. That wouldn't make sense. There's nothing to punish me for. Most people probably could not boast such a thing, but according to the text, Job was a particularly upright man. The point is, we're getting two different profiles of calamity between Esther and Job that are worth contrasting. On paper, physically, the net result looks pretty similar between what happens to Haman and what happens to Job. But the difference is, in Esther, we get a sense of who Haman is and how he thinks about himself, life, death, pride, getting things. And in Job, we get an even deeper look at who Job is and what mindset he represents, which is a mindset of grief, of hurt, of even confusion and frustration, but one of bending the knee to the providence of God even when it doesn't make sense. Sometimes we look at two different parts of the Bible and we see overt prophetic fulfillment. Sometimes we look at two different parts of the Bible and we just see narrative completion that started back here and now it wraps up over here, and you got to look at the payoff in order to understand the whole picture. Other times we see these thematic echoes that we've been talking about. And here in the midst of Haman's calamity, when we also look next door at Job's calamity, I do think we see echoes, and that contrast is set up intentionally to make the reader pause and compare these two guys, their various fates, and to reflect on what a right posture is in the face of calamity and in the difficult things in life. All right, back to Esther chapter 7 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.